I'm a radio operator in a small Colorado town. Something is taking us one by one. I never thought my job as a radio operator would put me in the middle of something this terrifying. Oaked, Colorado, is a quiet town. Too quiet. Less than 300 people, no real crime, no breaking news. Just me, the radio, and the long, lonely night shifts. Until last night. At 11:57 p.m., the town's emergency sirens all went off at once. Then my radio signal was hijacked. A robotic voice came through, cold, emotionless, inhuman. It gave me 7 rules to survive until dawn. And then, people started disappearing. I tried to warn them. I tried to follow the rules. But now, I'm not sure I was ever meant to survive. Because those who do aren't human anymore. Call to action for Mr. Quentin's channel. If you love mystery, horror, and eerie tales from the unknown, make sure to subscribe to MR Quentin. There's more to this story, and I'm not the only one who's seen the signs. Hit like, drop a comment, and turn on notifications, because in places like Oaked, you never know when the next warning will come. Stay alert, stay safe, and don't break the rules. Subscribe now to MR Quentin. I have always believed that nothing ever happens in Oaked. The town sits in the remote wilderness of Colorado, surrounded by dense forests and mountains that stretch beyond the horizon. With fewer than 300 residents, it's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the biggest event of the year is the county fair. I work the night shift at Oaked Public Radio, the only radio station in town. My job is simple: play music, report local news, and keep an ear out for any emergencies. But let's be honest, emergencies don't happen here. At least, that's what I thought. Everything changed on the night of November 17th. The night Oaked's silence was shattered. At 11:57 p.m., a sound ripped through the town. The wailing of emergency sirens. Not just one, all of them. Every single alarm in Oaked blared at once. The ones outside the town hall, the fire station, even the old rusted warning system no one had used in decades. The deafening noise was so sudden, so overwhelming, that for a moment I froze in place. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the radio signal cut out. Dead silence. Then, something else. Something worse. Every frequency, every channel, every wavelength was taken over. The same message, broadcasting simultaneously across all radios in town, including mine. The voice was not human. It was mechanical, emotionless, and hollow, like something artificial struggling to mimic speech. Emergency alert. Oaked has entered a critical state. I stared at the radio console, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The words felt unreal, like something out of a horror broadcast. But this wasn't a joke. The voice continued. To survive until dawn, you must follow these 7 rules. A chill ran down my spine. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no service, no Wi-Fi, just the unbroken voice on the radio. I grabbed a notebook and a pen with shaky hands as the broadcast listed the rules. Rule 1. Do not attempt to leave Oaked after midnight. The roads will not lead where you expect. That was absurd. What did it mean? Was this some kind of local government drill? Rule 2. If you hear knocking on your door between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m., do not answer. It is not a visitor. I felt my stomach tighten. Rule 3. At exactly 12:15 a.m., turn off all lights and remain silent for 5 minutes. Ignore any sounds, no matter how familiar they seem. I swallowed hard. Rule 4. Do not acknowledge the man in the blue coat if you see him. He is not real. That was when my hands started to shake. Who the hell was the man in the blue coat? Rule 5. If your reflection moves when you don't, avoid all mirrors until sunrise. I forced myself to keep writing. Rule 6. If the sirens sound again, hide. Do not look outside until they stop. The final rule made my breath catch. Rule 7. At 3:33 a.m., You will hear your own voice calling your name from outside. No matter how much it begs, do not open the door. Silence followed. I sat there, the pen still pressed against the paper, heart pounding in my chest. Then, as if on cue, my studio lights flickered. I spun around, my breath quickening. The emergency generator should have kept everything stable. But for a brief moment, the power wavered, casting long, unnatural shadows across the room. I checked my phone again. Still no service. The town was silent now. The sirens had stopped. No traffic. No movement. No wind. Then, a knock at the door. A single, rhythmic knock, knock, knock. My breath hitched. I stared at the station entrance. A thick wooden door with a small, frosted window. The rules came rushing back to me. Rule 2. If you hear knocking between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m., do not answer. It is not a visitor. I clenched my jaw. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Another knock. Louder this time. I stayed frozen in place, my mind racing. Then from the window a shadow moved. My blood ran cold. I reached for the switch and shut off the lights, barely remembering Rule 3. Silence. I held my breath. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Something shuffled outside. The door handle jiggled. A voice, eerily close to my own, whispered through the crack. I know you're in there. I pressed my back against the wall, squeezing my eyes shut. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The footsteps moved away. Then, nothing. I didn't dare move. I waited until my phone screen read 12:20 a.m. before I flicked the lights back on. The room was empty. The window was clear. But I knew something had been there. I didn't leave the station for the rest of the night. I kept the lights off. I didn't check the mirrors. I didn't acknowledge anything I saw outside. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I heard my voice again, calling my name, pleading, begging. But I didn't open the door. I sat in silence, gripping the notebook where I had written the rules, praying for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains, the signal on the radio returned to normal. No more sirens, no more voices, just the usual static of morning talk shows, as if nothing had happened. But I know the truth. Something changed that night, and I don't think Oaked will ever be the same again. I sat at the radio station, gripping the notebook where I had written the 7 rules from the eerie broadcast. My hands were still trembling from what had happened earlier. The knocking, the voice that sounded like mine, the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over the town of Oaked. I knew this night was far from over. Then, the radio crackled to life again. The same robotic voice spoke, but this time it delivered a new set of rules. I grabbed my pen, my pulse pounding as I wrote them down. Do not look outside from midnight until dawn. Do not answer the phone. Do not go outside. If you see someone outside, they are not from Oakdale. If the TV turns on by itself, leave the room immediately. If you hear footsteps inside your house, hide immediately. Do not sleep. If you wake up and something feels wrong, it's already too late. Only 7 people will survive until dawn. Make sure you're one of them. I stared at the last rule, my throat dry. 7 people. How many were left? I swallowed hard and looked at the clock. 12:42 a.m. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The entire radio station was plunged into darkness. The hum of the equipment died. The glowing console dimmed. The emergency generator should have kicked in, but it didn't. For the first time since I had started working here, I was in complete silence. Then came the shadows. Through the frosted glass of the station's front window, I saw them. Dark figures, gliding noiselessly across the street. They didn't walk. They slid, their movements unnatural, like they weren't bound by the laws of this world. There were dozens of them. I ducked behind the desk, holding my breath. Then, The radio came back on. Not with music, not with static, with whispers. Dozens of overlapping voices speaking in low, hushed tones. Some of them sounded like people I knew, others were unfamiliar. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. Then, the phone rang. A sharp, shrill ring echoed through the dead silence of the room. I turned toward the desk where the old landline sat. The caller ID was blank. I wasn't supposed to answer it. That was rule number 2. But when I heard the voice on the other end, my blood ran cold. It was my mother. She had been dead for 3 years. "Ethan," her voice crackled through the speaker. "Ethan, sweetheart, pick up the phone." My entire body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her voice was exactly the same as I remembered, soft, warm, except for one thing. There was no emotion. "Ethan," she repeated, more insistent this time. "I need you to let me in." I forced myself to stay frozen, gripping the desk so tightly that my knuckles ached. Then, the phone stopped ringing, and something knocked on the door. Knock, knock, knock. Soft at first, then louder. I could see the shadow through the frosted glass. Then her voice came again. "Ethan," she called from the other side of the door, the exact same tone, the same warmth. But I knew it wasn't her. I covered my mouth with both hands, pressing my back against the wall. The knocking grew insistent. Thud, thud, thud. "Ethan, honey, it's me. Open the door." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. This isn't real. This isn't real. I shut my eyes, repeating the rules in my head. Do not answer the phone. Do not go outside. Do not acknowledge them. The knocking stopped. Silence. But I knew, even though I couldn't hear her anymore, she was still there. I stayed pressed against the wall, barely breathing. The air inside the station felt thick, suffocating. Then the whispers returned. This time, they came from inside the room. I didn't dare move. My eyes flickered toward the large mirror mounted on the opposite wall. For a second, I thought I saw my reflection move. Before I did, I yanked my gaze away. Rule number 5. Avoid all mirrors. I shut my eyes, focusing on the slow, measured sound of my own breathing. Outside, the shadows continued to move. Inside, the voices grew louder. Somewhere in town, a siren wailed again. I gripped the notebook, staring at the final rule. Only 7 people will survive until dawn. I didn't know how many were left. I only knew one thing. I had to make sure I was one of them. And dawn was still hours away. I thought the worst had passed. That if I followed the rules, I would be safe. I was wrong. At 1:34 a.m., the radio crackled back to life. The robotic voice returned, this time with an ominous update. "A rule has been broken." My breath caught in my throat. Then, the voice named the first victim. Victim, David Hollis. Occupation, bar owner. David. I knew him. Everyone did. He ran Hollis Tavern, the only bar in town. He had a sharp tongue and a kind heart, always pouring drinks for regulars long past closing hours. Violation, looking outside. I felt my stomach twist. David must have seen them, the dark figures that had glided through the streets earlier. The broadcast ended with a single chilling word. Status, erased. Not dead, erased. A word far worse than death. The disappearance. My hands fumbled for my phone. I dialed David's number, my fingers shaking. It rang twice before he answered. A harsh, ragged breath. Then a whisper, barely audible. Not human. Their eyes. Their... A piercing scream. Then static. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my pulse pounding. David was gone. I didn't know what had happened to him, but I was sure of one thing. He wasn't coming back. The chain reaction. The radio buzzed again. Another message. Another victim. Katie Harper, occupation diner waitress. Katie. She worked the night shift at the Oak Diner, serving coffee and pie to the few people who stayed up late in town. Violation, falling asleep. Status, erased. I gritted my teeth. Then another name. James Marston, occupation, mechanic. Violation, answering the phone. Status, erased, the rules. They were breaking the rules, and now they were gone. The final name hit me the hardest. Lisa Calloway, occupation, librarian. Violation, watching the television. Status, erased. Lisa had been one of the kindest people in town. She always kept the library open late for kids who needed a quiet place to study, and now she was gone. I clenched my fists, feeling helpless. One by one, they were disappearing, not dying, not leaving, erased, as if they had never existed at all. The town was changing. I needed to know. I reached for the Oaktown census, a printed list of every resident. My heart pounded as I scanned the names. David Hollis, Katie Harper, James Marston, Lisa Calloway. Gone. Their names weren't crossed out. They weren't marked as deceased. They just weren't there. I flipped through the pages, my breathing ragged. Every record, every piece of official documentation, as if they had never been part of Oakt. No one would remember them. No one except me. The town was disappearing. A realization hit me like a freight train. The town itself was shrinking. It wasn't just the people vanishing. It was Oakt itself. I pulled up an old town map, tracing my fingers along the streets. There were gaps where buildings should have been, places that had names, histories, memories, but were now just empty spaces. The diner, the library, the auto shop, erased, like an unfinished painting, with whole sections fading into nothingness. A horrifying thought settled into my mind. What happens when there's no one left? What happens when I'm the last name on the list? A town on the brink. I checked the clock. 2 a.m. The night wasn't even halfway over. I was running out of time. I clutched the notebook, reviewing the rules over and over, committing them to memory. Do not look outside. Do not answer the phone. Do not go outside. Do not watch the TV. Do not sleep. I couldn't afford to slip. Because if I did, I wouldn't just die. I'd be erased. And no one would ever know I was here. I had to get out. The walls of the radio station felt like they were closing in, and the silence, the unnatural absence of everything, was starting to suffocate me. I needed to find someone. Anyone. The town was collapsing, people were being erased, and I couldn't be the only one left. The thought of stepping outside terrified me, but staying inside, waiting to disappear, was worse. So, gripping the notebook with the rules, I unlocked the door and stepped into the night. I saw her standing by the diner, Katie Harper, the waitress. I knew she had been erased. The radio broadcast had said so. But there she was, in the exact same uniform she always wore, blue apron, messy ponytail, an old name tag barely hanging on. She was facing away from me, standing perfectly still, too still. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I hesitated before calling out, "Katie?" She turned. No movement, no shift of weight. Just 1 second she was facing away, and the next, she was looking at me. Too close. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen her move, hadn't heard footsteps. She had been there, and then she wasn't. I took a slow step back. Her eyes were wrong, too wide, too bright, like she had forgotten how to blink. And her smile, God, her smile, was too big, too stretched. I knew then. Katie wasn't Katie anymore. She had been replaced. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care if she followed. I just ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed for me to stop. The Oaked gas station was still lit, a beacon in the darkness. And there, leaning against the counter, was Mark Finnegan. I barely knew Mark, a guy in his 30s, worked odd jobs around town, always kept to himself. But right now, I didn't care. He was human, or at least I hoped he was. Mark looked up as I entered, his face pale, his hands trembling. "You're alive," he breathed. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "What happened?" I asked. Mark ran a shaking hand through his hair. "My brother," he knocked on my door. He was calling my name. I froze. Mark's brother lived in Denver, 2 hours away. He shouldn't be here. Mark's eyes darted around, paranoia creeping into his voice. It sounded just like him. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. I didn't open the door. I swallowed hard. That was the right choice. Mark nodded, but something in his expression made my stomach twist. And then I realized I didn't remember his name being on the census. A horrible thought clawed into my mind. What if Mark wasn't real? What if he had been replaced? I studied him carefully. His breathing, his blinking, the way he shifted from foot to foot, human movements. But that didn't mean anything. The thing pretending to be Katie had looked normal at first, too. Was Mark one of the 7 survivors? Or was he something else? The thought made me sick. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't even trust myself. Then, the door swung open. Sheriff Dalton stepped inside. He was one of the last people I expected to see alive. The old sheriff was a mountain of a man, with deep lines on his face and tired eyes that had seen too much. But tonight, he looked like he'd seen the end of the world. He took off his hat, exhaled sharply, and looked between me and Mark. "It's worse than we thought," he muttered. I swallowed. "How many are left?" Dalton's expression darkened. 7. The number from the rules. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Mark looked just as rattled. 7 people? He echoed. "That's all?" Dalton nodded. "And that's not the worst part. Some of them aren't real." I stared at him, my throat dry. "How do we know who's real?" I asked. Dalton's jaw tightened. "We don't." I looked outside, toward the empty streets. The town was still disappearing, buildings had vanished, people had been erased, and now, they were being replaced. I didn't know if Mark was real. I didn't know if I was real. All I knew was that sunrise was still hours away, and I had to make sure I was one of the 7 who survived. At 3:46 a.m., the radio spoke again. "A rule has been broken." I didn't want to hear another name, but the robotic voice didn't care what I wanted. Victim, Mark Finnegan. Violation, questioning reality. Status, erased. I turned to Sheriff Dalton, my hands clenched into fists. Mark had just been standing next to me. We had spoken. We had feared together. And now, he was gone. There was no sign of him. No clothes left behind. No body. No proof that he had ever existed. The space where he had stood was empty. Dalton didn't react. No surprise, no grief, just quiet acceptance. He exhaled slowly and muttered, 7. I swallowed hard. The number had been reached. I expected relief, or at least some kind of emotion from the people who were left, but there was nothing. The remaining survivors stood in the gas station's dull fluorescent glow, motionless, silent. Their faces were blank. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't relieved either. They just stood there. I turned to Dalton. "What's happening?" His tired eyes met mine. "It's over," he said simply. I shook my head. "Over? Just like that?" He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Write it down if you want, kid, but by tomorrow you won't remember a damn thing." The horrifying truth. I felt something shift inside me. Something cold, wrong. I looked at the survivors again, really looked at them. Something about them felt off. The way they stood too still, the way their eyes never really focused on anything. I thought about Katie, the thing that had replaced her. The thought crawled through my mind like a parasite, digging in deep. I turned back to Dalton, my voice shaking. "Who are we?" Dalton's expression didn't change. "We're the ones who made it." I took a slow step back. "Number That's not true. My pulse pounded in my ears. I grabbed the notebook, flipping through the pages, desperate to hold on to something real. The rules, the names, the warnings, proof that I had lived through this night. But my own handwriting was fading. The ink blurred, the words becoming unreadable, like they had never been written at all. I gasped. Dalton watched me calmly. There's no point fighting it, Ethan. I shook my head, the sick realization solidifying in my chest. We hadn't survived. We had been replaced. The game was never meant to be won. The town had made its choice. It didn't spare people. It chose new ones. The survivors weren't saved. They were substituted. The real Mark, Katie, Lisa, David, they were gone. And so was the real me. I felt it now, like something unraveling inside my mind. The things that made me, memories, emotions, fear, they were slipping away, replaced with acceptance. I saw it in the others. They weren't blank because they were numb. They were blank because they weren't human anymore. Neither was I. I looked down at my hands, expecting to feel horror. But I didn't feel anything at all. I turned to Dalton one last time. What happens now? He gave me a small, tired smile. Now, we live. The sun began to rise, the night had ended, and just like that, the game reset. The town stood still, waiting for its next round of players. The sun rose, but it wasn't the sun I remembered. The sky was painted in pale, washed-out hues, as if someone had drained the color from it. The sunlight itself felt wrong, thin, artificial, more like the memory of morning than morning itself. Oaked still stood. The buildings hadn't vanished, the roads hadn't crumbled, and the trees still lined the empty streets. But it wasn't the same town. It felt like a perfect replica, a reflection in a mirror that almost looked real, until you noticed the cracks. The survivors who weren't I stood outside the gas station staring at the others. We were the 7 who remained. But none of us spoke. No one cried for those who had been erased. No one celebrated surviving. We just stood there. I looked at Sheriff Dalton. His face was the same, strong, lined with age, but his eyes were empty. Katie, James, Lisa, all gone. And yet, we hadn't lost anything, had we? Because the town had replaced them, including me. Becoming a part of Oaked. The realization didn't hit all at once. It seeped in slowly, creeping through my mind like ink bleeding into water. I wasn't Ethan anymore, not really. The fear, the desperation, the fight to survive, it was fading. I tried to grasp at my memories, tried to hold on to the panic that had ruled my every thought just hours ago. But I couldn't. The horror was still there, but it didn't hurt anymore. I wasn't resisting it. I was accepting it. The rules were never for us. I looked down at my notebook, the pages now blank. The rules I had written, the names I had recorded, the desperate scribbles that had felt like my only anchor to reality, gone. The town hadn't made those rules to save us. They weren't to protect us from them. They were to determine who would stay, who would become part of Oak D, who would be chosen. I had followed the rules, and in doing so, I had unknowingly sealed my fate. I had survived, and that meant I no longer belonged to myself. The town breathes. I looked around. The town felt alive, not in the way a normal town does, with people, voices, and movement, but in something deeper. Like the streets, the buildings, the sky itself was watching, waiting, for the next time, for the next players, and I would be here, just like Dalton, just like the others before me, waiting, watching, guiding the next unfortunate souls who stumbled into Oak D's game. The cycle continues. I turned to Dalton, my voice hollow. What now? He shrugged, a small empty smile playing on his lips. Now, we live. His words felt eerily familiar, and then, without another word, he walked away, his footsteps fading into the unnatural morning light. I stood there for a long time. Then, without thinking, I walked back toward the radio station. Back to where I had started. Because that's what I was supposed to do. I was part of this town now. And soon, new voices would come. New people, new players, and the game would begin again.